Hey guys, welcome to the last week of philosophy and Christian thought. You made it, almost. One more week. So we've got two big assignments due this week. First is the axiology essay. Axiology is a big word. I had to look it up myself. It just means values, like the philosophy of values, the study of what is actually important in life. So that's pretty cool. You get to write a paper on that this week. See the suggested questions on that, and make sure you use one of those, and send me your thesis ahead of time. I'm telling you, it takes planning, but it really helps. It will really, really help you write a good essay. So please send me your thesis ahead of time, and let me check it and work through it with you. Second big assignment this week is the Theodicy project. You've been working on that in your groups for the past month or so. Now it's time to pull all of those thoughts together into one PowerPoint presentation talking about what's the deal with a loving God and a messed up world. How does that work out? How do we make sense of all of that? Alright, so I want to share just two basic things with you as we wrap up here. First is a little devotional thought from Psalm 107. Psalm 107 says, "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His faithful love endures forever. Has the Lord redeemed you? Then speak out. Tell others that he has redeemed you from your enemies, for he has gathered the exiles from many lands, from east and west, from north and south. Some wandered in the wilderness, lost and homeless." And then it goes through all these different scenarios. Some were in prison, in chains of misery. Some were fools and suffered for their sins. Some were sick and knocking on death's door. Some went off to sea and ships to trade the oceans, and they were caught in storms. And then in each of these stories, it has this refrain. "Lord, help," they cried in their trouble, and he rescued them from their distress. And then it unpacks what God's rescue was like for them. And then at the end of the psalm, there's this beautiful line. "Those who are wise will take all this to heart. They will see in our history the faithful love of the Lord." They will see in our history the faithful love of the Lord. So as you think about your life, I hope you'll be able to look back on it and see in your own history the faithful love of the Lord. Because God's there, God's working. Look back, and I bet you'll find him. You may not have felt him at the time, but I bet if you look back with openness, you'll see that God was there working. God was doing good stuff even when you couldn't see it, you couldn't feel it. May you see in your history the faithful love of the Lord. So, history. That's kind of one of the big topics for this week, is the philosophy of history. There are three philosophical questions in history. First, what is a good history? What makes up a good history? And second, how subjective is history really? I mean, how objective, how subjective is it? And third, is history moving in a particular direction? Or are we just wandering? Or are we going in a circle? So first, let's tackle that first question. What makes something a good history? There are a few basic things. First, it tries to be objective. So it tries to state the facts as they really happen. Also, it incorporates multiple points of view. Anytime history is told from the perspective of one party all the time, that's questionable. And good histories use other sources. It's not just one person's story. And they also question the sources. They question, are these sources valid? What perspective were these sources told from? Was there a particular bias? Did they tell the story this way for a reason? And how close were they to the actual events? Was this history written down within, say, 10 or 20 years of when this stuff happened, or 100 or 200 years of when this happened? Obviously, the closer it is to the actual events, the more reliable it is. Also, history tends to pay attention, good histories pay attention to cause and effect, natural cause and effect. They don't assign stuff to the whims of the gods. Also, history doesn't try to fit the facts into an ideological framework. It doesn't try to squeeze the facts into a particular mold. It just says, this is what happened. And a good history understands events within their own social context. So it's not enough to just say, such and such happened. You have to understand why that happened and what it meant in that society. And a good history will tell us the story of the events. It takes all the facts and shapes them into a narrative so that we can understand them in context. So then the next question is, to what extent is history telling subjective? This is a really hard question if we're honest, because some people say history is always told by the winners. I mean, think about the American Civil War. How would we tell that story now if the South had won? Who would be the villains in the story? Probably the North. The people in the North would be the villains, the oppressors, the people trying to come in and tell other people how to do their things. Another example of this is this perspective problem and subjectivity issue is South Korea is always objecting to the way Japan's textbooks tell the story of World War II. They're always saying, no, you guys are minimizing all the stuff that you did. History depends on your perspective. So we have to ask, how much do our own biases color our interpretation of history? And we ask, how much does our culture shape the way we understand history? So a couple of examples here. Foucault gets a lot of press when we start talking about the philosophy of history. And one of the things he says is that the meaning of words changes over time. And not just words, but even our categories of thought change over time. Just a simple example, think of Psalm 23. It starts out with, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." I won't want anything? I won't have any desires at all, ever? Well, the word want actually changes. It changed over time. 400 years ago, I shall not want meant I won't have any needs. God will provide all my needs. It didn't mean I won't want anything. It meant I won't lack anything. So words change, categories of thought change too. Also, think about culture in America in, say, the 1800s. They had this concept of manifest destiny. It was the bringing civilization to the American continent, and they even had these huge paintings, this whole mythology about civilizing the North America. And I remember one painting in particular. It was like white light was moving this way, moving from east to west across the continent, and then the dark clouds and savages were being pressed further and further back. Well, that had a particular historical perspective, and now we look back on that and call it genocide. At least some of us do. So perhaps that wasn't our God-given destiny. At least that's debatable. So culture really does shape how we understand history, and that's pretty important to understand how that shapes it and what that means for how we interpret history. So another big question about history from a philosophical perspective is history moving in a particular direction? Are we actually going anywhere? And there are two core ways of thinking about this. First is history is cyclical. We're just going around and around the same events. It's like we're on this journey around the same mountain. The same basic things happen over and over again. But the other basic perspective is linear. So we're moving in one direction. So with linear theories of history, you have history divided into all these different stages. And different theorists, different historians divided into different stages. You know, maybe pre-modern, modern, post-modern. You have the ancients, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the modern period. And there are various types of myths of progress. But then there's this whole other category of like apocalyptic literature, which is God's going to do this huge stuff at the end times and totally shift history into another dynamic. That's also linear. It's going somewhere. So for Christians, we actually disagree a lot about this. We agree that history is linear, but we disagree about the details of how that'll play out. So the book unpacks that quite a bit, and I'll leave that with you. There are a few basics about what Christians agree on. It is linear. We're going somewhere. God has a plan for the universe and what's going to happen. But the details are unclear. We don't even agree on a lot of the major points. Some Christians think the world is going to get better and better and better until heaven comes on earth. Other Christians think the world is going to get worse and worse and worse and worse until God blows the thing up and takes all the Christians to heaven. Those are pretty divergent views. But Christians have both of them. Some Christians have each side of those opinions. But what we do agree on is God's going to bring a good thing about in the end. A couple of basic things also. We agree on the narrative of history. There's creation, a good creation. There's the fall, where humans sin and mess it up. And then in the end, there's restoration. Christians also agree that Jesus will return to judge the living and the dead. What that looks like, how he judges, what happens when he judges and comes, we disagree on some of those details. But here's the one thing that we all agree on. And as we wrap up this class on philosophy, here's what I really, really want you to remember. All Christians agree that God will make everything right in the end. God will restore humanity in the end. God will restore creation in the end. Whatever is right, whatever is good, that's going to happen in the end. When we look back on life, or when we look at the end, when God brings whatever the end is, everybody who looks at it will say, yes, that is good. That is right. All right? Thanks for being part of this class.